Alright, what's going on everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So in this one we are taking a look at tonight's card release, which is Silk, the first card of the Spiderverse season, dropping outside of the season pass. Now this is one I've been excited about for quite some time. This one was leaked or data mined a very long time ago. I've been eagerly awaiting it, and now we are finally about to get access to her. So I'm really excited to go over some day one decks, but before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about the card itself, as well as if this is a card that's worth your 6,000 tokens. So Silk is a 2-cost 5 power with the text, after any card is played here, this moves to another location. So very powerful stats for cost. However, the ability, sometimes it's an upside, sometimes it's a downside, and I think the biggest takeaway here is unless you're playing it during the final turn without having priority, it's not going to be the easiest thing to predict in terms of where it's going to end up at the end of the game. And that's true both for you and the opponent. So sometimes maybe that'll be a good thing, sometimes it won't. You do have to worry a little bit about the fact that you can actually clog up your own lane with Silk, which could be a little bit of a problem. But I really like the design on this card. I think it's very interesting. It also helps with move synergy cards like Kraven. Kraven's really the big one that comes to mind, but just in general, even Miles getting to move this card around a bunch, make Miles more consistently cost 1, so you can just play him for cheap whenever you want. I really just think this is a pretty powerful card. It remains to be seen if it's going to be, you know, the missing piece that move is needed. We've seen Ghost Spider has been really good for move so far, kind of propelling that deck upwards from where it was previously. And Silk and potentially one of the later cards coming in the month, Spider-Man 2099, both look like they're trying to also kind of help give that archetype a bit more power and direction. So Silk is the only Series 5 card dropping this month, aside of Nebula coming out of the season pass and into Series 5. But the other cards coming this month are going to be Series 4 cards, so that puts us in kind of an interesting position here, because you could buy Silk or you could buy Spider-Ham and 2099. And that's kind of a difficult question to ask there, and I think ultimately what it's going to come down to is the type of decks you like playing. I think if you like move style decks, Silk is probably going to be a smart purchase. And the other place that I think has a lot of potential for this card is Sera. Sera really likes 2/5s because they become 1/5s with the Sera effect. And as we saw with Mysterio shortly after release, 1/5's pretty good. And then you don't have to worry about the downside on the card. So to me personally, I think this is one of the better Series 5 cards they've released recently, but I think the best advice I can give about buying this card or not is if you're on the fence, if you're not totally sold, I think the best advice is just to wait a few days, wait for the initial hype to wear down, see what people are doing with it, and get a feel if it seems like a card you actually could see yourself wanting to play with. That's probably the best advice for a card like this, especially when the other cards coming this month are a bit cheaper in terms of cost. So that's probably what I do if you're not super convinced, if you're a little bit on the fence. I would recommend just waiting a few days and seeing how things shake out a bit, as well as, you know, potential balance updates and whatnot, because we're going to be getting the Conquest patch this week. So that's what I think about Silk. Really cool card. I'm excited to experiment with her. Now, let us take a look at some day one decks, courtesy of Safety Blade. Again, link in the description to the article if you want to import any of these decks or just get a little bit better feel for what they're trying to do. Highly recommend checking out the article in the description below. Starting it off, we have the Move 2.5 deck, and this is basically, you're just jamming all your good move cards in a deck and calling it a day. We've already seen a lot of players having success with move again with the addition of Ghost Spider. I think that card's been probably more powerful than a lot of people, myself included, initially expected it to be. Kind of thought we'd need to see more of these cards like Silk in 2099 before move really got off the ground, but Ghost Spider has been a really nice addition to the deck, and I think Silk is kind of the other half of that coin that's really going to boost up some of the synergies in this deck. fact that you're always having something moving around. You're going to be having that cheap miles all the time. It's also really, really good with Kraven. I'm really hoping this ends up working out because I love the idea of the synergy there, just bouncing her all around the board. Kraven gets nice and big, and it just kind of makes things a little bit difficult for your opponent to be able to kind of reasonably predict where all your power is going to go on the final turn of the game. Another interesting thing here is this is obviously a Heimdall deck, but we could even do something like playing the Heimdall in our Silk lane to move Silk and then get her to move again. There's some cool stuff we can do with that, but this is really just kind of deck where if you just want to play all your move cards, this is probably the deck for you. And then we have Chavez at the top there just because it's really important for us to draw these early game cards on time. And you know, we want Heimdall, but we don't need to Heimdall every game, because sometimes the threat of Heimdall, when they see we're playing all these move cards, is enough to make them play around it in kind of a weird way. So actually not playing Heimdall on the final turn can sometimes take people off guard. So Chavez is extra nice in that regard, because she also gives us something to do on the final turn that isn't Heimdall, if we want to try and take them by surprise. Then we have a Darkhawk deck. So this is pretty neat. So we're kind of merging what has been one of the better mid-rangey decks in the game, which is the Darkhawk package, with a move package. And the idea here is we're just putting out a whole lot of stats. So Kraven can get really big from the stuff moving around, especially with Silk. We have the Darkhawk package, so we have Rock Slide, we have Korg, Zabu to make him cheaper. Still running Miles, much like the Black Bolt Stature deck, where he proved to be very powerful as long as you could get him consistently reduced, and this deck has a ton of ways of getting him consistently reduced, so that's really good. Polaris, very handy for pulling around a Nebula, or just sometimes playing it in a lane where they have their lone 1-drop or 2-drop, so you just get a 3/5, which is solid. Ultra gives us a really nice payoff for our move cards like Ghost Spider and Iron Fist. Gets pretty big pretty quickly. We have Shang-Chi as a bit of reactive tool, so we can deal with things that get larger than us. Overall, I really like the idea going on here. It feels like a bit lower to the ground tempo style deck, and I think that is something that could be fairly well positioned, especially with the disruption of the rocks. So if you like Darkhawk, if you like Silk, this is probably one I would try out. Next deck we have here is Silk Wave. So this is actually very similar to the list I used to hit Infinite this month, obviously before Silk came out, but Wave is still really, really good for keeping in check a lot of these strategies, namely bounce, but not only bounce, just generally decks that are trying to play a lot of cards on the final turn. Bounce, Sera, Mr. Negative, etc. All these decks that are really trying to play a lot of cards on the final turn of the game really hate Wave, and this deck has a lot of solid 2-drops that we can pair with Wave on turn 5, and a lot of solid ways to close out the game on turn 6 with 1 card, with things like Arrow, Heimdall, or Chavez, so we have a lot of options there. I think Arrow is pretty underrated right now, especially in a deck like this where if we can leverage our move cards to get ahead in the early game. Nebula is also pretty decent for that too, if the opponent doesn't end up respecting it. But if we can get ahead early on, lock them down with a Wave plus 2-drop on 5, and then close out with something like Arrow if we're expecting them to just slam their biggest thing. Seems pretty good, especially with the High Evo Hulk still being very popular. Heimdall obviously really good with our move cards, and then Chavez because much like the original move deck we looked at, this deck cares a whole lot about trying to get its cheap cost cards available on curve, so getting that extra consistency is very helpful. Then we have the only stats deck. So this is a deck that, even though it got nerfed a little while back with Stature and Black Bolt both losing 1 power respectively, this is still a good deck. I've played quite a bit of the post-nerf version of Stature Black Bolt, and I'm kind of surprised at how few people play it. I think it's a case of one of those decks where it got hit and people just moved away from it, but it's actually still very strong. obviously using the Darkhawk package, just because that's one of the better mid-range packages available, but we do have Shuri as an addition, and I've really liked Shuri quite a lot. Shuri's been very, very interesting. Just being able to slam it on the final turn. Sometimes you're able to do things like Shuri, Miles, Stature on the final turn, take people by surprise, which is really nice. Also, Shuri plus Silk is a really interesting combination because you can get Shuri down on turn 4 or even turn 3 with Zabu. You follow up with Silk, and then because we're getting all this power, a lot of times we'll have priority, and we can just play something into the Silk lane. So it makes it really hard for the opponent to Shang-Chi the Silk at 10 power because she's just moving around the board all over the place. So I really like that. It also is helping get our Miles down more consistently, and we're running Kraven because of the synergy there with things like Jeff as well as Silk herself. But this, I think, has the potential to be one of the stronger builds for a deck like this. The core of it is already proven, and the new addition seems like it just lines up very well with what this deck is trying to do, which is output a whole lot of stats. Then we have the deck where I think this is going to become an absolute staple, and that is in a Sera control style shell. This one is leveraging a bit more of the move stuff, though you don't necessarily have to do that if you don't want to. I do think it is worth experimenting with, though, because Kraven for a 2-drop can get out of hand pretty quickly with very minimal support. But the main thing here is that we are just very effective at putting out a lot of stats on the final turn. We can mitigate Silk's downside by playing her as a 1 cost for 5 power at the end of the game. Usually we will not have priority, so she's not going to be moving anywhere unless we choose to make that happen. Cloak is kind of interesting in that respect too, because we can also just play him on the final turn as a 1/4 if we don't want to have to worry about the effect. Or we can move some of our cards around with Kraven to get him boosted up from a 2/2 all the way to a 2/6 or a 2/8, which is obviously really, really good stats for the cost. This one does go a little bit lower on the tech card tools, but I really do think we have the best ones in here that you just need in every Sera list, which are Killmonger and Shang-Chi. Enchantress still obviously a decent choice, but I think a deck like this, you do want to be a little bit lower to the ground. You do want to have a pretty high critical mass of 2-drops because they only cost 1, so you can play a whole lot of them on the final turn, play 3 of them with the Shang-Chi, or just go all in and slam as many as you can to pump that Bishop and pump that Hitmonkey. So I think if you're looking for a deck that utilizes Silk, but doesn't necessarily need to lean into the move theme, Sera Control is probably the best bet for you. And then last but not least, speaking of control, we're going to take a look at a lane lockdown version featuring Silk. So we have the typical lane lockdown trio of Storm, Professor X, and Spider-Man. So a lot of different ways to close down lanes. And then we have quite a few cards that really benefit from the fact that our opponent is going to be kind of awkwardly forced to play into just 1 or 2 remaining lanes. Things like Rocket Raccoon, Star-Lord, Gamora, all pretty good with that. Also, Star-Lord and Rocket are both pretty good follow-ups to the Storm turn. Silk is kind of neat because if we close down the Storm lane, we always have a chance of pushing her over there if we want. And then if you wanted to include something like Jeff in this deck, if you have access to him, you could even push her out of the Storm lane, which would be kind of cool. We are running armor though, because this deck does really appreciate its 1-drops, especially Nebula. Nebula is just really, really strong, especially if we can get her nice and safe in a locked down lane. And more decks are starting to run Killmonger again because there are a lot of powerful 1-drops going around, namely Nebula, Kitty Pryde, among some others. But we are seeing that start to return a bit, plus the fact that we do have some things that can get Shang-Chi'd here, like Gamora and Chavez, even though we won't be playing Chavez a lot of the time, as she is there for our draw consistency. Sometimes just slamming a Chavez on 6 really isn't the worst thing in the world, depending on the deck you're playing against. You will have to keep Doom in mind with a list like this, because Doom is still very popular, but we should have enough stats where we can reasonably fight for enough lanes, even when accounting for Doom bots. So if you're a fan of the lane control style deck, but want something a little bit different than the high Evo version, which was just recently nerfed a bit with the change to Spider-Man, this is probably a pretty solid way to go. And there we have it. Those are our day 1 decks for Silk. So I'm super pumped for this card. I'm going to be streaming with it tonight. Really looking forward to it. Going to be trying some of these decks out. So if you want to see them in action, feel free to check out the stream later on. And if you want to import any of these decks or read a little bit more about the logic behind them, highly recommend checking out the article from Safety Blade in the description below. But that is going to wrap it up for this video. Let me know what you think about Silk in the comments below. Is this a card you're excited for, not excited for, planning on picking it up or passing on to get the other cards available this month? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. But that's going to wrap it up for this one. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and stay tuned here on Marvel Snap Zone for all your Marvel Snap content.